Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Discomfort Zone podcast.
The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person, to unburden the gods.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode. I can see Archangel Gabriel and Crimson Cloud Patient Zero. Thank you very much for being here. Right, let's get to it. This episode is actually a little different. I won't bother you with all of the technical difficulties that I've had, but suffice to say, I've had some issues with my phone, and some of the things that I'd organized got lost. Anyway, we're here now, and I thought the last couple of episodes have been... Can everyone hear me okay? The last couple of episodes have been rather thick and heavy with details. Oh, hi Crimson Cloud, Patient Zero. Great to have you here. And so I thought this week we could try something a little bit different, as it were. Now, we are going to carry on with our narrative and our timeline. But first, we're going to approach a new subject, really. So the subject of this week's episode is war. And that's a pretty big subject, I know, and it's one that I think we're all too familiar with one way or another. But I'd like to take this opportunity to analyze it a little bit. And the reason I want to do that is that in my mind, when I read Sitchin's theories and heard all about the Anunnaki, etc., it shed a very different light on wars, on the concept of wars, on our history of human beings. Really, throughout history, we can see that all nations seem to be afflicted with this almost phenomenon. And I think when we read through Sitchin's writings and hear the origin and where it actually started from, then that really can show things in a very different way. And hopefully, maybe we can learn from it for later. Oh, vaccines, thank you for joining us. Okay. So in order to talk about this, I'd like to categorize different types of wars. And I'm going to start with 3 different categories. And we're actually going to begin with the end, and that is modern warfare. Now, modern warfare we can categorize for our sake, purposes, as secular wars. Now, really, if we want to look at this closely, we don't need to look much further than the last 100 years. We have plenty of cases. And we can see that all of the wars that were fought under a secular guise. Now, really, this started with the Age of Enlightenment and the beginning of the separation between church and religion and science, basically. And from that developed what we know now as all of this secular morality and codes of ethics and all of these ideas that basically were now detached from the religious, spiritual, metaphysical origins. And so from this period on, the wars that were fought, because of the change in the zeitgeist, the change in the way that people viewed the world, they needed to be sort of have different reasons to go to war. And the reasons have pretty much stayed the same no matter which side you look at. When you see the justifications, it amounts almost always to basically the need to survive. So all of the wars that were fought were in some way justified as self-defense, and more often, not more often, but also very often the case was a preemptive strike, a preemptive attack in order to prevent the enemy attacking. And this sort of concept is something that we see, I think, very often. We even have a phrase for it. The best offense is defense. And I think that originates from basketball, but it's certainly been taken to be understood literally as well. And often is the case when nations and leaders have been faced with a threat that it seems just the mere thought and fear of the threat can justify the act of war and going in order to prevent what might happen. So let's say that modern warfare in general, from the age of enlightenment to today included, has been very much a war that is fought under sort of national, political reasons and justified with a sense of threat. Whether or not, I didn't know it's a Dennis Rodman quote. That makes a lot of sense. So when we look at this, we can see that there seems to be this attempt to view the war as being self-defense to a ludicrous proportion. And I'll take one very simple example, although there are many, but if we look at the Vietnam War, we can see that war was treated as a threat to the American way of life and indeed to American lives eventually. But it's a war that's not fought on American soil. It's a war that's fought overseas, very far away, and it's very much a conceptual war against, communism. So we can see this utilization, this masquerading the war as self-defense, as something that's done not as an act of aggression, but as an act to survive, when clearly we can see that's not the case, at least looking at it back from years ahead. So what is a survival war? Well, in my terminology and what I'm talking about, this would be what we consider tribal wars. And we're not talking specifically about all of the age of Anunnaki right now. We can even look at these examples of tribes who were alive and still living as hunter-gatherers over the last century, who have never been discovered before, mostly, I think, in the Amazon and definitely in jungles and tropical areas where they were more well hidden for so many years. We can study that behavior, and anthropologists have done so, and see a lot and learn a lot about that way of living. Whether it's changed or not, we can definitely tell as much as possible from earlier times. When these tribes go to war, it's very much a survival war, which means it's fought very near to their territory, either defensively or expansion. It's usually fought when it's absolutely necessary. And although there were definitely warring tribes who did it more than others, we'll get to that in a minute. But what I'm talking about is the smaller tribes where going to war would be something very costly, both in terms of lives and in terms of the resources. And so just as we see in the animal kingdom, the decision to go to war is very much derived from an instinct to survive. We can see a lot of similarities, I think, between pack animals and territorial animals, monkeys or wolves, etc., and human tribes, where very often it's not a matter of decimation of the enemy or, simply going and burning, but it's actually a fight where you're sort of trying to gain something quite real, and the result changes your life quite drastically on a very personal level. As opposed to the modern warfare, where a lot of the time people who are at war, nations, citizens, don't necessarily feel it. They might, have less money, things might be closed, but that's a very big difference to, for example, your city being bombed or things like that. So we have these two sort of kinds of wars that we've defined: the survival war, which is a war that's actually fought to gain something real, very close to home, personal, and what I term the secular war, which is the modern wars that we all know much better. And then we have the interim, basically, the vast period of time that spans from, let's say, the end of tribal the tribal age and really entering civilization and larger collection of people, all the way up to the Age of Enlightenment. And it seems to me that throughout that time, more or less, there was a different kind of war, which didn't exist before and hasn't existed since mostly, not entirely, but mostly. And that is the religious war. Now, when I say religious war, I mean specifically a war that was fought in the name of a god, but also at his or her command. Meaning that it wasn't, the kings or the priests who instigated the idea to go to war, but it was a command from up high that what needs to be done is to go to war. And we can see different examples throughout history of very, very confusing commands, such as attacking your own city, where in the case of Babylon, the king who was appointed, I believe his name was Naram-Sin, who was a Babylonian, was ordered by his goddess to retake the city from the false gods, and so he went to war with, as it were, his own citizens. Or another example of when enemies were coming to attack an Akkadian king, and his gods told him to stand down and specifically to go to his home and get into bed with his wife, but not to approach her for some reason. And he disobeyed this command and decided to go to war anyway, and trusted his troops to do battle, and ended in obviously defeat. And so these examples show that for these kings, queens in those times, going to war was not automatically something that was driven by the gods, but necessarily for success or for defeat, as it were. You had to have that affirmation that there was a god behind you. Now, during this period of time with religious wars, if we look back into ancient history, we can see that again there's two different kinds of religious wars, and we can distinguish them by the proximity of the gods to the wars. What I mean by that is that in some cases the god would give the command to go to war, but then stay in their abode, in their temple, and the troops would go on and do battle in their name, as well, very clearly we could see is the case with the Christian Crusades. But long before the Christian Crusades, there was a very different kind of description, and that was the description of gods fighting alongside men in the ranks, and in fact, playing an active part in the battle. One of the most famous cases of this, I think, comes to us from the Greek mythology, and it's Homer's Iliad, which, although I have read, I have to say, was a very difficult read for me. I find it very hard with all of the descriptions, and it's a very, very descriptive book. But amongst all of the scenery and sunsets and sunrises, there is a clear description of various gods, Ares, and I can't remember, I think Mercury, I actually can't remember now, but taking an active part in the battle, drawing their weapons, taking out the enemy soldiers. And this is clearly stated and differentiated from other wars or from other gods who are said not to have joined. Now, it might be a good idea at this point to reiterate something that I've already talked about, which is the understanding or the interpretation of mythology as either a lyrical, poetic expression, or simply a misunderstanding and a confusion of causes, where any war that we win means that God was on our side, and any war that we lose means that God wasn't on our side. And then you can just retroactively fit on whichever was right, and you'll always state the true case. Obviously, it's very hard to outright disprove this claim. As to do that, we'd probably have to talk to someone in those times. But if we keep our ears open and keep our minds open when we're dealing with this subject, and not automatically assume that everything that we think and know is more correct than anything that they knew in ancient times, we might be surprised by the way that they are describing things, because the kings of old and these rulers, well, first of all, they certainly don't seem to be simple people who are stupid or ignorant. Definitely underdeveloped in comparison in terms of the advancement of civilization and the evolution of culture. It would be hard to conduct a normal conversation with them, but when you see the way that they did battle or lived their lives or interpreted the reality around them, they weren't very quick to simply label things for no reason and just, this is the god of wind, this is the god of suns or whatever. There was a lot of details in these descriptions, and there was a lot of sort of drama, change of heart that goes through when the gods were dealing with humans and when the relationships developed. So we're going to get into that more, and that's basically going to be the subject of this next chapter. So at this point, maybe I'll talk a little bit about what's coming up. We've actually entered Sitchin's third book, which is The Wars of Gods and Men. And this is the, as it were, the continuation chronologically of where we left off, following to the final point that we're headed towards. And so I skipped over Sitchin's second book because that book deals specifically with attaining eternal life and man's quest to try and get the gods to give them longevity. So I decided that for now we're not going to deal with that. Instead, we're going to continue with the chronology. And in fact, these next few episodes are actually going to be concerning the third book. And then we're going to reach the end of our dealing with Sitchins for now. We'll see if we'll enter a little bit into South America, but I think we're going to take a break from Sitchin and move on to Drunvalo. But before we do that, the reason I'm telling you all this is because I would like to do an episode of a Q&A. So obviously, if there are no questions, then I will find the what to fill the time with. But I'd like to give you a heads up, probably in the next 4 or 5 episodes, I believe. If you have any questions about the timeline, about what's happening, if you have anything that I haven't addressed, make sure to write it down, and we'll save it for that episode. So, sorry, just a little break to let you know what's going on and where we are. So all of this talk about wars is really to bring us to the state of mind which is before the continuation of our tale. And in order to do this, I think it's very important for us to delve a little bit deeper into what this concept of war really is, because it seems to me to be quite paradoxical. On the one hand, today, nearly everyone agrees that war is a bad thing, and throughout history as well, we've had a lot of instances where wars have sort of cost more, and there are no winners, there are no victors in wars. It seems clear that we can see the heavy price that we pay when we go to war, and yet, as I pointed out in the beginning, we constantly are finding reasons to legitimize going to war and making war not only an option, but in fact a necessity. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about my personal experience with this subject. I haven't actually fought in any wars, which might sound silly, although it shouldn't, but many of my very good friends have. I was in the army, as you'll probably know, but I was a drill sergeant, as it were, in training. So I never actually participated in combat. So my experience with war was actually less during my time in the army and more simply as an Israeli citizen growing up when I did. And this is something I think I've actually mentioned also, but in my mind, this is a normal situation for all Israelis who grow up and live in that environment. This concept of war is something that's much closer to home. It's something that we live, through the education from a very, very young age. Whether it's the historical wars that the Jews have been through, and we'll actually touch upon those as well. And obviously, whether it's the modern wars that have been happening since the founding of the State of Israel. So it's a subject that's a little bit difficult to talk about because, well, first of all, it's a very touchy subject, and I think the subject of Israel is very touchy, and wars in Israel, specifically the combination, is a very difficult thing to talk about. So I really don't want to offend anyone. I don't want to step on any toes. What I'd like to do is share my own personal perspective and experience, and hope that you might be able to learn something from it. That is it, I promise. Well, growing up in Israel, I experienced the first actual experience of it was in the Gulf War, which was in the 90s. I actually can't remember the exact year, 93, 94, I think. Check that up with me. We've all got internet, doesn't matter. I was very young, but I do remember going into one room in the house and closing it off with thick sellotape and just, yeah. I can't remember much of what happened, but I definitely remember that air of urgency and danger. And it's one of my, not the, but one of my first memories. It's a very early memory that I have. I actually don't know how old I was, but in my mind, I was quite young. And I think growing up from that point forwards, the other wars that I personally experienced were on the borders of Israel. And so, since in the Gulf War there was a threat of chemical attacks that could reach anywhere, thanks to the missiles, the danger was imminent for my personal house. But the later wars were actually further removed. However, there were what we have world over now come to know terrorist attacks, which is definitely not a war, but they do share a lot of similarities, and I think it's very often that places that suffer from terrorist attacks will have a war that's ongoing or on and off throughout history. That was certainly the case in my experience, and the combination of these two things has certainly left a lasting impression on both me and everyone that I know. It took me a long time to realize, and was actually listening to a podcast by Joe Rogan, where he spoke of talking to his Israeli friend, and his friend mentioning that he grew up in a war zone. And this really surprised me because I'd never thought of it that way. I'd never phrased it that way. I'd never considered myself being someone who sort of grew up in a war zone. And obviously a big reason for that is that in comparison to many war zones in the world, my situation was very good. I mean, obviously this isn't rubble on the streets, bombings every day, shootings outside, as is the case even with places that aren't war zones today. But nonetheless, it was important for me to realize that, yeah, growing up and having this sense of fearing for your life, this sense of survival, this sense that there is an enemy across the borders who throughout history has attempted to attack and could attack at any moment, that sense really shapes the way you see the world. And obviously today we all know about PTSD, but throughout history in the beginning people were much less aware of it. But I believe it seems to be a running joke, because in Israel there was very, very little recognition of this, of people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and specifically soldiers. It's a very bad image for war, actually seeing the price that people pay, even in times of peace when you have an army. So it was something that was covered up for a long time, and then actually the treatment with psychedelics is what helped bring it to the surface. I won't say very much, but it was certainly one of the things that sort of became, I think, worldwide much more acceptable to talk about treatment of PTSD and ex-soldiers telling really amazing stories. I haven't been treated for PTSD, and I don't think that I have it as severe as some of these soldiers. In fact, I definitely don't. Which makes it all the more, well, it's just, let's say, different, but that normalization, that ability to function with it, is something that we see in Israel all over. Everyone is functioning to a certain degree with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it shows. It shows in many different ways of the level of anxiety, the level of fear and distrust. These are all examples, I think, that are very easy to see how Israel is a very specific and unique place. And obviously now, in these times, it's almost easier than ever to see. So that's a little bit about the psychology, and from my experience, how that can affect us. The other big player in war is obviously politics, and I include finance and money with this as well, because that is all handled in the political arena. It was quite some time ago that, well, for those who don't know, I should probably clear up. In Israel, there is a very sad situation where there is a minority of people who aren't considered, who are legally not Israelis, living in a sense under Israeli jurisdiction. And the fact that these people are of the same race of the enemy doesn't help things at all. Now, I really don't want to get into the politics of it in any way. It doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned. What is important, and what's something that everyone can agree upon, as is always the case, is that both of the sides of this ongoing Cold War are suffering. I think, in my opinion, one side is definitely suffering more than the other. But nevertheless, the people who are actually picking up the guns and going to fight, the people who are, on the front line, the people who are actually executing the orders are not gaining anything from it. And this is the paradox of wars. We see time and time again that the people are suffering and continue to suffer from a situation that, in a way, they are continuing to create and to manifest. And I had to ask the question of why, how could this happen? Why are we doing this? I myself was in the army as well. Why are we all simply going along and continuing this behavior? And the only reason that I can find, or the best reason I think that I can find, is that there is a small number of people who are benefiting from the situation, as is always the case. And I don't think the names are important in any way, because they can change and come and go. But there is always a minority of influential, powerful, wealthy people who are the only ones to benefit from this senseless act. And I personally believe that that is the case in Israel as well, as is seen that well, to relate it just 1 minute, all of these problems could be solved very easily given the right tools and time. But the situation continues to stagnate and be the same because both sides continue to be sort of flared up with everything that happens, and we never reach that point where we can realize, hang on, this is not working. We should really be doing something differently. So that's my take on the Israeli politics of the situation there. And the reason I bring all of this up, and the reason I've taken the time out of this episode to talk about it, is that for me, this is the link between what we've been talking about until now in the story of the Anunnaki and the origins of human beings, and the state of the world today, the situation that we find ourselves in thousands and thousands of years later. And the politics of it certainly is one of the main instruments that deals with it. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But first, I'd like to just mention very quickly, because I feel that it's necessary, one further aspect of war. Now, this isn't something that we're going to go too deeply in right now. It's going to be further on, but it's important, I think, to note that another aspect of war is the spiritual aspect. Now, I don't mean by this politicians abusing or using spirituality in order to gain some power or influence and to do what they want. I'm talking literally about the spiritual effects of wars in general, and specific wars at that. Now, this is an idea that obviously, again, isn't my own, and it's something that's expounded by many people, but the idea is that whenever a war is fought on the, let's say, the spiritual plane, the spiritual side of things, there is an effect that happens. There is a change that takes place. And we can liken that change, for lack of better terminology, to a certain change in frequency. And I think frequency is a very good word. We use it. I use it a lot. If we think of certain emotions or feelings as having a certain frequency, so when someone is happy and when someone is joyful, they're emanating a certain frequency. War and obviously death and desolation have a certain frequency. And one person is emanating a certain frequency. Whenever that's amplified to many, many people, like the participation in war, the spiritual effect of that to the change of the frequency and the consciousness of the people and of the surrounding area is obviously much larger. And the bigger the war, the larger number of casualties, the more of an effect it obviously has. So I just mentioned that very quickly because I feel it's important to understand, well, in my mind, there is more that's going on here than just mere money and sort of political control. There is actually a shift in consciousness, or a state of consciousness, that's being fought over at the same time. And even if we don't want to deal with, gods and that kind of spirituality, we can see, as is the case, I think, in Israel, that when a populace is under the threat of war for a long period of time, or living in fear of war, it actually accepts war much more quickly. And it normalizes that situation. And this is always the case of, if you do something enough repetition, it's not just with words, you can normalize it and make it more easy to accept. I think a very crucial example of that now is in the US with everything that's happening. I have no doubt in my mind that the fact that the US government was able to enforce curfews to prevent riots was very much possible because of the curfews that were already implemented for Corona. As soon as curfews were implemented, as soon as the idea was implanted, it becomes much more acceptable. And if once people would say, you can't give me a curfew, this is a free country, post-Corona, nowhere is a free country. We've all been under curfew. We all know how to deal with it, and it becomes an option. And the very same thing happens with war. I think for a certain period of time, there was this saying that when Israeli mothers gave birth to boys, they would say, by the time he's 18, there won't be any more wars. They've stopped saying that. And people in Israel are sort of always waiting for the next war. And then it doesn't matter how long it'll take. As soon as it comes, that will verify that feeling. So in that sense, whether we call it spiritual or conscious, as far as I'm concerned, they're very close together. The changing of consciousness of people through the act of war means that by normalizing it and by making it more common, we're actually making sure that it will continue. And so you're really changing the state of people's consciousness and the state of affairs in general. So that's just a little bit about spirituality. What I'd like to mention before I continue, let's see, riots cure COVID. Absolutely. What I'd like to talk about is a little bit of the politics. Because despite what I said about spirituality, politics do play a very significant role in war. And they are, as I said, our link to these conspiratory subjects. Now, researching this, I could have given thousands of different examples, and I implore you, as always, if this is something you don't know about, if this is a subject that interests you, please go and research it yourself. To each his own, and I'm not going to say anything is absolute truth, but I definitely think it is important to investigate for us, for human beings, for everyone, and for our leaders, to investigate the actions and the secret actions of governments in times of war. Because it has always been the case that wars have been a great time to get things done, as it were. It's the biggest distraction, and when people are frightened, they are in a very different state of listening, as it were. The part of the brain which sort of discerns and is rational and is critical is shut off and is bypassed by the limbic system, the amygdala, which is the emotional part of our brain, because it's in this state of fight or flight, the state of survival. So when a nation is at war, maybe in modern times less so, but the wars of old, the last 100 years, when there was the president went to give his speech, or his, whatever you call it, announcement, all America was listening, or all of the citizens of the country tune in to soak up the words of the leader who is now in charge and telling everyone what to do. And it's a very different level of obedience than is usually achieved through peace. So it's clear that we can see that war is used to pass legislation and to do all sorts of things which are preferred to be hidden. One of those examples which I would like to give here, because we should actually be focusing a little bit, is the Second World War. And the Second World War was obviously a very unique occurrence. I've mentioned it quite a few times. It's a big part of my of my philosophy, because it's a very crucial example. We don't have many examples like that. Now, obviously, during the war, by 1942, as it were, the whole of the Allied forces were fighting the Nazis and attempting to stop it in any way. And even those who were sort of on the fence as to whether to join or not, it certainly was agreed upon that everything should be done to stop this movement. And yet, it came to light years later, obviously, secretly, that although the US government was banning Germany and blockading its fuel routes, Standard Oil, the Rockefeller-owned private company, was still conducting economic deals with Nazi companies, specifically Farben, GF Farben, FG Farben, I can't remember their name, but the German chemical company. And I'd like to offer a quote here, one quote from an article talking about this. So let's see. Hang on. Okay, let's do the quote, and then I will get back to revised sociology. I haven't read it yet. So, the alliance of Standard Oil with the Nazis wasn't well regarded by the US government. Above all, after they entered into the war after Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, officials remembered an old law, trading with the enemy, and opened a formal investigation against Standard Oil. So, Standard Oil was trading with the enemy, was conducting business with Nazi companies during the war, post 1941, when the US had already joined. And the US launched an investigation, and then the accusation was that the company hid patents from US Navy and supplied fuel to German submarines. John D. Rockefeller said, John D. Rockefeller said that he wasn't aware of that, and Farish pled no contest to charges of criminal conspiracy with the Nazis. So that's good to know that you can just, basically say I didn't do it, and that's pretty much it. In March, the Pentagon begged. In March 1942, the Pentagon begged President Roosevelt to stop the investigation to protect war production and oil supply. Roosevelt agreed, and the company paid a fine of $5,000 and promised to stop fuel supply for the enemies. So this was the situation in one, specific example, but we see time and time again that in times of war, there are many, many, many losers, but there seem to be those who are benefiting, usually financially, from the situation. And we'll get into exactly what US oil was trying to do and whether it was pure greed that was motivating them or other things. The Rockefellers are a very important family, I think, to study in all of these dealings. And I'm sure I can see in chat as well that people are very much aware of a lot of these things. So when we're looking at wars and wars in human history, I think it's always very important for us to look at the sides that are profiting from it and the hidden ties that we see between the different factions, because this is really the theme that we're going to be touching upon in the coming episodes. Okay, let's see what time. Okay, we're doing well. Let me just go over chat very quickly and see if I missed anything. Yes, war on COVID. In fact, I think, IG Farbin, thank you very much, Patient Zero. It was really the war on drugs, I think, as far as I can tell, which was the first war on a concept. And that was in 1964, I believe, the war on drugs was declared. And then the question became, how do you fight a war on drugs? How do you win against the concept? Is it when there are no more drugs in the world? These are obviously subjects I'm not going to get into because I think most of us agree today about the war on drugs. But we are waging another war against the concept, which is the war on terror, which is an amazing invention because some would say that war terrorizes. And if war creates terror, then conducting a war on terror will promise it to be a perpetual war. So it's a very interesting idea. And indeed, now, very recently, we can see the war on pandemics, where viruses are the new enemy. And it seems human beings have forgotten how nature works, basically. As is the case with so many of these things, we're fighting wars that we can't win, and often wars that even if we did win, would cost us more in fighting them. And so, in fact, that might be a good... Okay, so let me just see... The US... vaccines, I missed yours. The US government was taken over by the Nazis after Nuremberg. That's basically who we're fighting against. And when we win the battle, we will have to face the reptilian blood. Yeah, the cult. We're going to talk about all that, but all of that is much further down the line, because the Nazi government, and in fact, for those who don't know, Hitler was very, very interested in the occult and the dark arts, and led many secret, unpublicized expeditions in an attempt to both retrieve artifacts and to conduct a very different kind of campaign than the one he seemed to be conducting with the army. We'll get into that as well, but that is a lot of new subjects. Right now, in fact, okay, we've got 15 minutes left. I was going to go over just the beginnings of the stories of the gods, but I think we'll actually save that since there isn't that much time left. We'll save that for next week and we'll carry on. So, yes, absolutely. Oh, what's Bleed for Me? The Dead Kennedys. I'm not sure I know that song, Revised Sociology. Enlighten me. The wars on this planet, the wars that have been conducted between humans for thousands of years, I personally believe have always been conducted with a clear idea in mind, even if those who were fighting them, kings included, didn't know about it. And this pertains both to the spiritual side, as I've mentioned, and to the hidden political agendas, which were often remain unknown to this day, or at least were unknown at the time. And so it's very important, I think, in our generation. And when I was going to do this episode, I was a little bit apprehensive because it's a very easy subject to talk about, I think, war. There are very few people who would argue the point that war is a good thing. They may say that war is sometimes necessary, as we've seen, but definitely when I say humanity should be moving away from wars, I don't expect to get much resistance. And yet, I did feel that it was important because our view of wars often is something that seems so senseless and illogical that it's almost hard to conceive why they happen, and therefore also hard to attempt to prevent them. It seems to be some kind of rut that we're stuck in. And it's to this point that I wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of war as it has played throughout history, and what are the implications that it has for humanity. Let's see, patient zero asks, the idea being depopulation or eugenics or people using wars to capitalize in the business space. If you're talking about, I'm definitely not going to say that all wars have one single agenda or they're all fought in the same name and reason. We can see that there were different wars fought for different reasons, but the general flow that we'll see, and this is going to be beginning with the first war where the gods enlisted humans to fight for them, alongside them. It was an idea that was brought to us from the outside. And that idea of taking up arms as a nation to fight for a god, for a concept that's larger for you, for something that's bigger than my life, was an idea that I think has carried on all the way to today. And so the reason wasn't specifically, the idea is that yes, one of the reasons for some of these wars was depopulation. If we look at certain quotes of historians of gods talking about too many human beings being around and the need to come and thin out the herd, then clearly depopulation is used as a reasoning, or eugenics, or any of them. But there's always, I believe, another agenda that comes from the affairs of the gods themselves, something that human beings were less privy to. Vaccine. Okay, I'm gonna rule it out. I can see in chat there's a few. Thank you, Revised Sociology. I'm gonna check that out afterwards, definitely. Interesting. Terrorist is a great song. Okay. According to the Masons, this planet is a farm for the reptilians. They consider us food. I hate calling them gods. Our flesh and blood, just like you and me. Just like me and you, sorry. Yes, good point. In terms of the Freemasons and the reptilians, when you say this planet, then that makes it sound like that's the entirety of this planet's story. And here I do want to say that I think there's a multiplicity of different races, and the reptilian farm is one which personally I do think has a lot to say, but In fact, that's exactly what pertains to what I was talking about, the spiritual side, the changing of frequency, the changing of consciousness. That all deals with a very biological effect that these things have on humans. What you're saying about calling them gods, I completely understand. When I say gods, I should actually iterate this very clearly. I don't mean, I don't know, deity or spiritual, etc. What I'm talking about is the characters from the Sumerian tales. And because we're talking about the Sumerian tales, I use the same words that they use, which was gods or Anunnaki. When we talk about Drunvalo Melchizedek, he in fact doesn't talk about gods in that sense. He talks about, beings and different terminology. And so I like to use the specific terminology that each of the researchers use. It also helps to, I think, clear things up and separate them a bit. So when I'm talking about gods, we're talking about stories that were told from the perspective of people who viewed these beings as gods. Okay? That is to say, if there is such a thing as a god, which I believe there is, it is in fact, a being, flesh and blood, and they talk about the gods as being flesh and blood. If you read the Greek mythology, there's a lot of wars between gods, and they get hurt and they bleed and they get injured, etc., etc. In fact, in the next episode, we're going to be talking about Horus, who lost an eye. So the gods that we mention are very much treated as both flesh and blood, and can be killed. Very different from what we consider, let's say, the deity in the Judeo-Christian mythology, which is a non-body, invisible, omnipotent, omniscient being. With the Greeks, with the Sumerians, with all of these ancient civilizations, the gods that they describe were nothing like that. And in fact, the Old Testament has mentions of parts of God's bodies and God wandering through the garden, etc., etc. So yes, it's an important point to make. I'm not mentioning gods as a omnipotent, invisible, presence, but rather the gods, as is distinguished often with a small g, that were beings, deities, non-human, but physical beings. And we'll get into that more in the coming episodes about what exactly physical beings means and what other beings means, etc., etc. So it's a very confusing subject, because so many different people talk about it from so many different angles that it gets a little bit confusing to try and homogenize it all together. So that's why we're going to be treating it in different segments. And as we come to the end, hopefully if you stay with me, we will be wrapping it all together and seeing how all of the different parts that we've talked about fit together. So patience, my friend. I appreciate your comments, and we will get further into it. It's difficult, as I keep saying, that some people are very much aware of a lot of these things, and I do try to make it open to people who are approaching these subjects for the first time as well. Okay, let me just see. What do they look like? Wait. Oh, I see. I've missed something. Anunnaki means those that sent to Earth in groups of 50. The number 50, I just will mention, is an important number in the Sumerian mythology. That was the highest ranking god on Earth. In fact, as some of you may know, the Sumerians had a hexagonal, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, math system, which means based on 60. And the highest number that was given to a god was actually 60, which was the number of Anu. But since Anu wasn't on Earth, the number 50 was given to Enlil, and he was the highest ranking. But yeah, each of the gods in the Sumerian pantheon were given a number. But the term Anunnaki literally means those who from heaven fell to earth, as it were. The Sumerian translation. Okay, let's see how much time. Oh, we've got 5 minutes left. Okay, excellent. So did I miss anything? Okay, I'm afraid I was actually the original idea was to have half of the episode to talk about it, and then the other half to continue the narrative. But I'm afraid I didn't quite make it this time. So thank you very much for staying with me until now. Next week we will continue with the tale, and in fact, quick recap for those who have forgotten or weren't here. We ended the last episode with the end of the deluge, the Great Flood. This was the time when Enlil and the other gods came to humans and accepted them as civilized beings, as beings who are likened to them, as beings who are worthy of a communicative relationship with the Anunnaki. And for this, in fact, there was another crucial piece, which we'll talk about a little bit in the beginning. Sitchin goes into great detail of the evolution of species and the different grains that came out of the Fertile Crescent. I won't go into the science of it too much. Again, if you're interested, you can read about it. But basically, this was the time when the sacred grains, the 5 grains, were given to human beings, along with the skills and the other seeds to plant and to basically refertilize the land and grow the food for the Anunnaki and for the humans. And so at the end of the deluge, there is this turning point where humanity is finally, as it were, accepted/ascended, not necessarily a good thing, as beings who enter a relationship with the Anunnaki, a spiritual relationship. And so we've talked about Sumer. We're going to talk about a few other kingdoms, but the next story that's of importance to us is actually in Egypt. And in Egypt, I won't go into it too much now because we will save it for the next episode, but we're going to see some of the Egyptian mythology cross over with the Sumerian. And at this point, I have to say, in Sitchin's texts, things can get a little bit confusing because there are a lot of new players. If until now the story has really followed the Anunnaki in one place and the human beings more or less in 2 places, let's say in Africa and in Mesopotamia, with the spreading of humans and the actually proliferation of the gods of the Anunnaki as well, there are more and more players. And this is when the Akkadian Empire comes, and Babylon, Egypt, and we'll reach the Indus Valley. So I'm going to try and navigate our way to keep what's important. If you're interested again in the historical names, the relation between the Old Testament and its places and stories and sort of modern archaeology, that's a huge amount of work of what Sitchin did. I just feel that for a lot of the people that might be a little less interesting, the huge lists of names and dates and places, etc., etc. But yes, I do want to say that for our story, we're going to be continuing in Egypt and the story of Osiris and Set and then Horus. So that's next week. Let's see. Is there a show at in 2 hours? Let me see on chat. Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. So nothing that important that I say. Oh, thank you, Crimson Cloud. I'm glad you enjoy. In fact, if I look at the time, that's pretty much the end for me. Great. So Crim is in 2 hours. Please stay tuned for her. A great show. Thank you all for coming. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I will see you all next week.